oh, whoops, right? Like, oh, we did this thing, and now we have to fix it, or now we put the work on the people doing that work to have to bring themselves back.
Welcome everyone to the Reproducibility Podcast. My name is William. I'm coming from Adelaide, so I'd like to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I'd like to thank them for their custodianship in the past, present, and into the future. Today I'm joined by Sarah.
Hey!
Sarah, you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, hello again, everyone. I'm Sarah, she, her. I'm a lecturer in psychology at the University of Lincoln. So I'm actually living on the lands of the people who colonized the land that I called home for most of my life, which is so-called Canada.
Yeah. Really love what you do with the acknowledgement of land, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I haven't changed it since I created it. I was trying to figure out for a while how I do that, because it is, I think, a little bit complicated because as much as I'm a settler, my own family's history is not tied to England at all. But they are like the original sort of colonizers of the land that I called home. So it's like, I don't know what to do with that.
Right.
But I don't want to ignore that relationship. And so that's the best I've come up with so far.
No, I think that's
open to suggestions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'd love to acknowledge any First Nations listeners we have, and thank them, and maybe they have suggestions too. We've got a pretty big topic, I think, for our episode today. We're going to be chatting about critical psychology or critical theory versus positivism. So we're going to go deep in the weeds of philosophy and epistemology, and talk about this in the context of open science as well.
Yeah.
So I suppose the first thing to talk about is, how did you arrive at thinking about epistemology and critical psychology and positivism? Like, where did you learn these terms? What was your journey there?
I was telling the story earlier today, and I still don't remember where it started. I don't quite know exactly how it started, but my background was definitely completely positivist. Like, my training in school, all of my formal training in psychology was completely positivist. There was no other option. So I was very much someone who was like, science is truth, and science has the answers to everything, and science says, and believed all the things, and was not critical of it at all in any kind of way. And I think what shifted it, actually, this is my best guess, right? My best understanding of my own history. Lol. I joined an activist / anti-capitalist book club with the Social Justice Cooperative in Newfoundland, Labrador, that I was a member of for several years. And the first book we read is called Caliban and the Witch. I've just finished rereading it. It's scary because she's telling the story of the enclosures and how the state started controlling women's reproduction more and more, and it was a capitalist move for primitive accumulation, and we're seeing the exact same thing happening right now in the US, and I'm just like, oh no. But that started to radicalize me, if you will, and I started making links, right? I was like, oh wait, so capitalism I had always understood as like just happening as a natural evolution of things, but like, oh no, actually it was really, really violent and it had to be implemented with a lot of violence to be maintained. And it is a violent system. Like, the more I read in that book club, the more I then came also to understand that science is implicated in this. And I was like, oh my God, science also has all these issues. And I was starting to come across critical literature and Indigenous literature and Black science literature. And my whole worldview shifted. It was really quite an interesting couple of years. And I also, amongst all of that, I was like, why did no one tell me this? Why was I not taught this stuff? So like, I'm entirely self-taught, if you will, in terms of like looking for critical literature and trying to understand things in a way that supports my activism and like view of the world and care for social justice, and trying to understand how all these things work, and then acknowledging that, oh, actually this applies to science. And so understanding epistemology, I think one of the biggest or one of the earliest and most influential books I read in the context of science is Pollution is Colonialism by Max Liboiron. I must have mentioned it before. I totally like this book.
Yes.
It completely shifted how I think about science and knowledge production, and it's been incredibly influential. And I've just kept going from there.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. What about you?
I also don't necessarily have an origin for how things happened. I mean, I would say like thinking about the open science movement and it being a critique of how research was being done was the first step to like the first domino, I guess, in my thinking of, okay, things aren't as simplistic and straightforward as it seems. So in some ways I was already moving towards like critical psychology, I suppose, like having that hat on just by naturally being critical of how we were doing research and starting to question how knowledge was being produced, questioning the systems in which we like do our research, and what it means to do science, right? Or for psychology to be a science. So like that came more naturally, I would say. It wasn't like someone taught me or told me.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, I didn't. I knew of the term critical psychology. I kind of knew what it meant, but it was sort of to the side for me for a long time. And only within the last year, when I talked to people who were like claiming they were, or like saying that they take a critical framework, they were essentially saying like, yeah, you are being a critical psychologist. And I was like, but this doesn't make sense with being a cognitive neuroscientist. Like, how, what's going on?
Yeah.
So another thing that I attribute this sort of how these questions started to arise was, I've said this book as well many times on this podcast, but Against Method by Paul Feyerabend. Like this idea that of science anarchy and like a totally radical way to think about how to do research in like, yeah, we should be steel manning other people's theories and or we shouldn't believe anything, like, be critical of all things. So like that kind of that was also another watershed moment. I was gifted that book. I had always wanted to read it, and then I was gifted it and I read it and was like, okay, nice. Yep, this is where I sit now.
I meant to once. I think I read the first page and was like, I can't. There was something about it that was just so dense. And I just went,
it is extremely dense. Yeah, it is extremely. It's not an easy. Yeah, it's not an easy read. It is not an easy read. There's a lot of good academic work or like stuff online that like the cliff notes, the breakdowns that are pretty good. I think there's a lecture on YouTube by someone from Oxford. Sorry, I've forgotten your name, but they do a good review of like Lakatosh versus Feyerabend, and they talk about Against Method. So nice. Yeah, so resources out there. We'll link that in the show notes.
Yes.
Cool. So yeah, I would say just as a at least my impression is that this is not a common thing that's discussed. We've kind of implied this already, that it doesn't pop up that readily in like teaching or in psychology courses. I don't know how, I'm sure some people are talking about it. I guess we should drop some definitions of these things.
Yes.
So my, casual observation is this critical psychology group tends to be, qualitative researchers, qualitative methods users, and that they have not been a major part of the conversation is what I would is my intuition. They aren't really
not
prominent.
That they don't want to be, but they've been marginalized.
Yeah.
Like an active exclusion.
Yeah, exactly. So just wanted to highlight that as well. And that has ramifications and it's part of the history of how open science and the open science movement got going and has been working, right? I'm realizing now we should probably provide some definitions for some of our listeners who are approaching this issue for the first time.
Yeah. I mean, I actually have a different understanding of critical theory a
Okay.
little bit. So it's not just about method for me, but I understand it more broadly as a way of knowing that cares about context.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so
I've
I think you can be an experimental, like you're saying, a cognitive neuroscientist who is critical,
right.
because acknowledging context is what makes the critical approach. Yeah. But so we want definitions in terms of maybe epistemology, right? That's one of those big words that gets thrown around quite a bit. And it took me a while to be like, what is this? And why are
Yeah.
we using all these big words for no reason?
right. yeah.
And so I teach epistemology as part of methods, research methods. I think it's where we should all start teaching research methods. And so I define epistemology as how we know what we know. It's, what counts as knowledge, basically.
Yeah, totally. Like a theory of knowledge is another term
Yeah.
thrown around for epistemology.
Yeah.
How does knowledge come to be, or what
Mm-hmm.
is knowledge? What is the form of knowledge?
Yeah. How is it produced? Validity is tied to that. So we also discuss in that lecture that I do about this, talk about validity, because different paradigms, well, there are different ways of defining this. Critical theory, positivism, interpretivism, they could be called paradigms, they could be called research frameworks, they can be called theoretical frameworks. Like there are different terms, which is not super helpful. Like different people use different terms to define the same
Yes.
thing. But all of that together considers how we make knowledge and has implications for what we consider valid, right? So whereas one might care a lot about replication as a sign of validity, a different context might not care about replication at all, but they'll care about, does it make a difference in our community? And if it does, then that's valid. And we don't care about anything else. Does it operate in context? Okay, then that's valid. We don't care if we can repeat it again in a different context because that's not what we care about. So we're thinking about the production and creation of knowledge at like a really meta level, which I
totally.
love. Super into it.
Yeah, so maybe a quick nutshell definition, as I understand it, is critical theory really acknowledges the role of the context in what is truth or what is the reality at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, these ideas of universality and complete reproducibility are like out the window, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't jibe well with a critical framework.
Mm-hmm.
On the other end, I guess largely treating it as a spectrum, but on the other end is positivism, which is probably the most, for those of our listeners who are in science or who call psychology science, would be more familiar with like the positivist framework.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to give a quick lowdown of what positivism is?
Yeah, so for me, I mean, I think it's tends to be synonymous with science, which I think is, problematic and part of the issue of where we're at. It was never pointed out to me that was what I was being taught was positivism. I thought was being taught was science, knowledge production. But so positivism essentially understands the world as having a truth that is discoverable. And so we can go out there and test things and find out the truth.
Mm-hmm.
That is an objective fact. And then I think we're actually, though, in post-positivism more. I think that more of us have accepted that there's not like an absolute truth that we can all know everything, but that there are things that are probably true with a high likelihood. And so we put a little bit more doubt in there, but we're still like, well, there's, some truths out there that can be, and that it's worth experimenting to test things systematically to find an answer to a question.
Right. To find things that are largely indicative of the world, are largely true, like, for example, phenomena that are observable, that we can capture with our experimental measures and methods and instruments. So it's probably good to mention that, this is not just a versus B situation.
Absolutely.
Like we like to do in psychology with our false dichotomies. But like a continuum. And as you mentioned, positivism is probably on the one extreme, but most scientists probably sit in this post-positivist kind of space, whereas those, and depending on the topic and methods at hand, especially because psychology is so interdisciplinary and so broad, depending on the kind of work you want to do and the kind of impact you want to have on society as well, would probably shape where you are on this spectrum, from positivism to post-positivism to critical theory to, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Constructivism, interpretivism, to me, like, it keeps
Constructive-
going,
yes.
right? I teach a little bit more. I mean, there's a limit to how much time we have, and so I pick like 5 dominant ones, and I teach that on a spectrum.
Yeah.
But
for the most
like
part,
we also alluded to, and we wanted to talk about, there is some flexibility, right? I do encourage students to think about which one they identify with the most strongly, so that you understand your own positionality, which is another we do a whole
another big
podcast
word.
on that.
yes.
And reflexivity, all that kind of stuff. But I say, like, what are you drawn to, so you can understand where you're coming from and see where you sit. But also, it's possible to move between them. So, like, we already talked about this a little bit, that both of us operate in more than one space. So my worldview is more on the constructivist, interpretivist side now, and I do critical work, but also, like, I do experimental lab work, and I do neuroscience, and I do stuff that are experiments, and I have a stats test, a statistic at the end that I check for still p-values. I still haven't gotten to Bayes stats. That's still a to-do list.
On the list.
Yeah, it's still a list to do. But because I can move between them based on context. Hey.
Right, totally. And talking about validity, like, there is a tension where it's like, if you take what I would say a naive, what you're taught science is, which is like, it's repeatable and reproducible and like blah blah blah, and it's subjective. So there's a tension of chopping and changing, for lack of a better word. You like for being flexible, for switching between these frameworks. In my mind, yeah, these different frameworks are applied according to different contexts, and so they can be equally valid or valid depending on what you do, or depending on the research question, depending on your approach. Like, so it's fine to move around as appropriate and justify that, rather, like, that change is okay here in this case.
I think so, yeah. But I also think that the two of us are kind of rare in that sense. Like, I've not come across people who are quite that flexible quite as much. Even people who fall into like constructivism, whatever, and they're like, no, I think this, because it is a worldview. Epistemology is part of a worldview. How you understand the world, how you move in it. It's really, really hard to change how you see the world. Like, that's not really a day-to-day thing that you do. And it's not that you can't see other points of view, but to really, truly operate with a whole different set of assumptions takes a lot of flexibility. And obviously, I can only speak from personal experience. I think it's a bit easier for me to move because I was trained in one particular one, but I've so wholly shifted elsewhere that because I've been to that other place before, I can go back to it. And so I'm familiar with that space, and all the assumptions that come with it are easy to just put into place. Whereas, I see this in student work, where in the way that we teach, that we ask students to consider their framework, and they'll say, oh, I'm going to analyze this data in a constructivist context. But then in the discussion, we'll say, well, it's only one person, so it's not valid. And I'm like, well, no, you've forgotten about what counts as valid, right? It's really, really hard to entirely shift.
Yeah, another example of that.
Yeah.
Another example of that, you tell them, take a constructivist approach to this thing, and then inevitably the urge is to do reflexive thematic stuff, and then like, wait, hold on, that's not what we do here in the constructionist world. Things like that.
Yeah, how would you define constructionist? Let's throwing around more words.
I mean, this is my naive understanding of constructionist. That the idea that the experimenter or the researcher builds the surrounding truth based on the content that the data that they collect, or the attitudes or the feelings that they observe. I mean, a lot of that was using positivist terms because that's where I'm naturally at. But that's my broad, off-the-cuff definition of constructionist.
Okay. No, fair enough. I think that ties into a little bit what I think as well, but it feels a little bit different as well. For me, it's co-creation.
Oh,
right? So
That's
it's creating knowledge between the people who want to create it. It's not, the knowledge isn't out there to be discovered and found, but it is created together, which I
yeah.
think is a little bit what you were saying as well, just using different words.
No, yeah. In my head, I had already like that was implied and assumed.
Okay.
I just did not speak that out. But yes, it is an operation almost, or a process with like you think about ideas of like co-design and that those kind of things, um, uh, like largely in a constructionist framework. Yeah, we should probably mention that you've written a nice little paper
Oh,
on these
thanks.
ideas. Yeah. Do you want to chat a little bit about it?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, it's currently a preprint. The first submission was rejected. Okay, I can
Sorry.
tell you a little bit about why. It'll make more sense if I describe the paper. So I wrote this with a friend and collaborator of mine. What we wanted to do was essentially put a spotlight on the underlying ideologies of dominant science that say those quiet parts out loud and point out that actually there is ideology at play. Here's what's going on. Here are the systems that are influencing the work that is done in like positivist psychology, in the context of music science, because we are both like music perception people, both musicians. And we wrote it, two things. We wrote it as a dialogue between characters, actually moderated by a third. So we
Yes.
have, what did I call them? True Detect is the
Yes.
positivist. These are bad, but I feel fun. And
No, I thought they were fun.
Theorize is the critical
Yeah.
theorist.
Yes.
And Macy Mediate is the mediator. And it's like a televised big debate thing is what we want to do. But anyway, so we have this critical theorist and positivist talking to each other about their work. Like, what do you consider to be good work? What matters to you? And they ended up talking about specific examples of research and how some research in music science can be quite extractive, especially when working on Indigenous peoples. And so trying to shift to a more critical and, for us, decolonial approach to doing research. So that's one part. The other part is that we included actual stuff that's been said to us in that dialogue, in conversation. So we marked, so it's part like autoethnography-ish. It's not really a deep autoethnography, but it's part storytelling of our own experiences, but told through a narrative point of view, or written as a narrative, I should say. We didn't frame it that way at the time, and so the reviewers were like, well, this is not scientific. No. And we were like, oh, well, you missed the point, I think. Sorry.
Yes, right.
So we're going to reframe it and be clearer about how we're framing it,
Right,
and
right.
submit it elsewhere. But it is available as a preprint. And I'm looking into doing some work to adapting it to a piece of theater with another colleague, and we're sort of, we're really looking into how we can
Fun.
expand this for accessibility, because we think it's a really important conversation to have, especially in an era where science is mistrusted, there's so much misinformation going around, and like critical thinking in the
Yeah.
general population seems to be a little bit on the decline. That sounds mean, but like I feel like it's
Yeah,
not
no.
that.
I mean,
that
given
wrong.
recent events, given
Yes.
recent events of
Yes.
what's happening across many different places.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's a very deliberate thing. Like it's very, very deliberate, right? Because you can't resist as much if you're not as educated. But anyways, so we're trying to use this work to springboard some of that more wider impact. But it was really fun to write, and it was really nice to be able to try to articulate these kinds of questions in like a narrative way. So I really like it.
yeah, it was fun to read, and like, I'm developing courses for the new university due to a merger. Anyway, besides the point, developing courses for research methods, and yeah, I've thrown that in there as a fun. Hey, have a read so this can, so you can get a better idea of where these epistemologies and ontologies and so on and so forth. So yeah, super fun. We'll link that in the show notes as well, and highly encourage people, especially if you're new to this. I felt like it was a very accessible way to get the ideas behind, at least grok, a little bit, get us familiarity with critical psychology or critical theory and positivism.
Yeah, in terms of teaching, I also I mean, hasn't happened yet, but we are going through revalidation soon of all our programs. So we're going to be reviewing our methods teaching. And I think by the time this airs, it'll be, done. I will be leading the redesign of the methods
Oh, very cool.
for our undergraduate and graduate programs, I think. So I'm very excited about being able to do that.
Yeah, fun,
I don't
fun.
have a fully fixed attachment to the outcome yet, but I have a really good idea of about the process to look. I want to be, I know how I want to consult everyone and have everyone's voice heard and think of how we can redesign this really from the ground up again. This is like a perfect opportunity to think about how we actually teach methods. And for me,
Yeah,
something that I think is really, really important is starting with epistemology, starting with what do we even mean by doing knowledge creation? Like, what do we even mean by doing research? That
totally.
is so important.
So I'm developing the third year research methods course now for third year psychology, and yeah, week one is history and philosophy of science,
Yes.
which touches on like
Yeah.
exactly those things. Absolutely agree that it should be part of all research methods courses at some point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. One thing I want to touch on that is relevant to this is that this distinction, let's say, that we've been this distinction we've had in our conversation of critical psychology and positivism has real implications for how we approach research rigor and open science, right? And I think this has largely been ignored in the open science movement and has led to marginalization of generally the camp that is in critical psychology. So maybe I'll give a brief overview, and you can fill in wherever you see necessary. So psychological research tends to fall in two domains. There's qualitative methods. Your reflexive thematic analysis is the most popular. You got qualitative content analysis, different forms where let's say the data that we collect tends to be things like interviews or forum posts or not group study
Like focus
groups. That's not the
groups.
thing. Focus groups. That's the word I was looking for.
Hey.
Focus groups. And so you take those and you synthesize the information there to come up with findings. So you often ask research questions about what a certain group is feeling, or you often ask how are people experiencing a certain thing. And then on the other side, which probably most of psychology is familiar with, is quantitative research. Your experimental design with control variables, with different conditions, either between subjects or repeated measures. You apply your statistical models like your ANOVAs, your regressions, your factor analyses, and these are indicative of the truth of the world.
The numbers.
Yeah, the numbers. It's all about the numbers, right? And there's a sense of context matters little or is not important for the question. So, like, for example, everyone remembers the same way. Although, if you take a more post-positivist approach, you do acknowledge these factors at play. And you can then apply quantitative methods to regress that out or control those variables or try and explain that, right? Of course, there are what I would say is rare is the mixed methods people. And it's a little bit tricky. This is a bit of a labeling issue. I think some people are mixed methods where they define their research questions through qualitative methods. They just don't publish it, right? Or they're like talking to people and then they, figure out and then they do the quantitative stuff. But there is a middle ground that I don't think people don't usually occupy, I would say.
Yeah, it's hard to do, right? 'Cause I think there's only a certain amount of space where both of those methods, because they're so different epistemologically, can overlap, right? I think postpositivism is one of them that does allow space. As I understand it, allows space for qualitative work, but more things like a thematic analysis, because that's quite systematic and it has like steps and it can be replicated, I would argue, and it can be pre-registered and it's a more systematic approach to things, whereas like an autoethnography is much more evocative. It's storytelling. It's your personal story, and then you're interpreting your own personal story through theory, which just has a completely different way of thinking. I mean, I've done both. I wrote what I thought was autoethnography, and my friend who has done these read it and went, "You wrote a qualitative piece, but it's not autoethnography."
You tried.
Okay, fair enough. So I'm still like too, quote unquote, air quotes, too couched in the positivist side to like really get into a proper autoethnography. And also, if I wrote that, I'd get in a lot of trouble at work. So it's the thing, I can't write it.
Right. Yeah. So I think maybe a helpful thing to solidify this idea is this idea that you can call psychology a science, or maybe you shouldn't call psychology a science and you should simply use the word research. Like, there's a difference between psychological research and psychological science.
Okay, yeah.
And so sort of generally applying this idea that psychology is a science, all psychology is a science, and bringing with it the like assumptions, like generally the positive assumptions of science to psychology is a little bit, let's say, simplistic, like overgeneralizing for the field.
I like that. I don't think I've ever heard that sort of distinction. It reminds me of the whole open scholarship versus open science labeling, right? Of like that exactly. Push to be more inclusive. So psychological research is definitely a really nice parallel to that, and a much more inclusive terminology. Yeah. Thanks. I like that.
So, given that there's these two camps, qualitative versus quantitative, critical theory and positivism is also in those. It's parallel to that, right? That parallel to the qualitative methods and quantitative methods distinction as well. So, recapping the history of open science a little, we recognize the replication rate of different sciences is not great. We actually evaluate that by doing this research to look at it and replicate the work and find that it's not replicating. It's largely led by psychology. And then we reflect on how we do research. We look at the research process, and given the context of our conversation before, we are reflecting on the positivist or post-positivist research process, and we figure out there are many pitfalls possible. This is most famously put in Marcus Manaffo's manifesto, the threats to reproducible science, where you've got that I'm sure most people have seen it, the circle, and then there's like there's like issues. So people realize, okay, there's decisions made at all these stages which could lead to p-hacking. You can so and so forth, publication bias. And so because psychology was largely quantitative and positivist, the call to change and the call to fix a lot of those things was based in that, right? Now, as a result, it's had an outsized, I think mostly positive, good impact on how we do research, like the call to be more transparent, to be more rigorous, to do things like pre-registration, to do things like share data, share your code, or share any other research materials. I think those are largely good forces, but one side effect of that is that it hasn't really considered what it might be for a qualitative researcher or a critical psychologist, where things like reproducibility are less important or less a sign of research rigor, right? Rigor means something else for them compared to someone who's in this positivist framework or who does positivist work. And we can be a bit more granular with this. Rigor is different for someone who's in cognitive psychology versus developmental psychology versus all these subdisciplines. What it looks like will be different to a lot of different subpopulations as well. But the main one is that it's been like the critical psychologist qualitative group has been largely impacted but ignored in the
Yeah.
open science.
So like increasingly marginalized, basically, right? A group that's already marginalized, if you're putting in requirements and policies at, say, the journal level, the granting level, or even the government level that require open data, that require pre-registration, that require these kinds of things, then you are systematically excluding particular types of knowledge production. And so that obviously has bad consequences, or obviously I think that has bad consequences. And that has been discussed before, right? So there's several works on this, particularly from a feminist point of view. I think we've discussed this on the podcast before, the feminist critique of open science, and part of it is that qualitative work gets marginalized as a part of it. And I know that there's one that I know about, and I'm sure there's more big European projects on developing qualitative frameworks for open science or open research that's qualitative. And so people have noticed at this point, but it's sort of whoops, right? Like, oh, we did this thing, and now we have to fix it, or now we put the work on the people doing that work to have to bring themselves back, while still being systematically excluded by the policies that the main movement has put into place. And so it's like creating more work for a group that's already marginalized, which is kind of how things tend to work, unfortunately. The work is always on the most marginalized to keep pushing.
I don't want to speak for them since I was in this camp, right, of this positive camp, but to try and exercise empathy and caring, as we should as scientists or as researchers. Part of it, some of it has been not willing to engage with the movement from the qualitative or critical side, right? Because they see it as a force of marginalization, and that makes sense. That's part of it is what I like to refer to as the tech bro-y, broken science kind of stuff that happened, and that really put a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths because of that. Just wasn't that was ignorant of how they do their research and their epistemology and their approach,
that's the thing, is it's tricky because it's you can't know what you don't know. If you don't know there's other ways of thinking, how can you possibly include them? But it's just that lack of awareness, right? But that lack of awareness is emblematic of the dominant cultures of the world, right? Like heteronormative white sexism, white supremacist sexism, all of that. If you are part of those worlds, you don't necessarily see those systems, so you don't know that they're there. And so it's just like another example of that at play in this particular context, where those who are like, oh, well, we want to make research better, but who aren't aware of other ways of doing, will never consider, never could have. I think some of the people who are spearheading are now aware, and they are acknowledging it, and they're like, oh yeah, sorry, we done fucked up, and how can we make it better? Right. But yeah, it is tricky. And I've talked about open science to some people who do qualitative only work, and they're like, yeah, no, we don't care. Why would we give a shit about this? It has nothing to do with our work because we don't care about reproducibility. I mean, the way I see it is that open science, or open scholarship, I should say, values transparency maybe the most. And whatever that looks like, like you said, rigor looks different for different types of work. And so we can't prescribe how rigor can look for different types of research. But I think it's interesting to try to encourage transparency as much as possible, right? Like we said before, there's that saying, as open as possible and as close as necessary. I think we've said it before, even on this podcast, right? So following that, I think is a good general guideline in trying to be as inclusive as possible. At the same time, I'm not sure that we should try to include all types of knowledge, right? Again, is that assimilative or not? I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I'm just thinking out loud now. If that's the point, right?
Yeah. I see a hierarchical kind of structure. Sorry, this is just how I think. So yeah, there is this let's say a general factor. Like there is this, I think, an attitude where it's an attitude towards being transparent and being rigorous as possible, and that applies no matter what framework you occupy or that you work within. Yes, what looks like what is rigorous and what is transparent is different, and maybe should policies and stuff and guidelines should operate at that level, right? But I would like those of researchers to sort of have this agreed understanding that we're all working towards having a positive impact on society and on knowledge creation and on each other. And if there's ever a time that you need to mobilize all the researchers, we haven't simply created divisions. We can agree that, yeah, we're all one group, especially in current autocratic trends in the world. That's important. But then so that's the top level. But then you've got this, what bottom level where it's like, okay, what open scholarship looks like to you is different, right? Or if you are working with sensitive populations, or then that's, maybe that information cannot be open or open data.
Especially in populations where historically data has been used against them, right? Like they have very good reason not to trust other people to look at their data, right? Particularly from my experience as, someone who lived in Turtle Island and worked in Turtle Island for a long time, the indigenous people all around the world, right, have their data has been misused. The same with a lot of narratives of Black Americans, right? So this whole deficit narrative where people who aren't part of the community will take data and go like, oh, look, this is proof of why these people are less good than us. And it's like, why would you do that? It's just nonsense to me. But that's how ideologies operate, right? That's how it works. And so it makes a lot of sense, right? And there's movements across the globe, across indigenous communities, for, I just lost the word, data sovereignty, right? There are books about this, not just textbooks, there are books about it and conferences and policies written to protect indigenous people's sovereignty over their data, that their information is their own. And so I think the policy should take that into account, right? There should never be any kind of forcing that data sovereignty could actually be something that I think, again, thinking out loud, that we could consider more widely. What does it mean who owns what data? Who has the right to access? Who has the right and why to make things openly accessible to other people? And then who has access to that?
To try and convey the problem in a more positive leaning framework, these are ideas coming from people like Nita Farahany, who wrote The Battle for Your Brain, because I am a cognitive neuroscientist. But this idea that if you share identifiable brain data, and then and it's open, people can essentially develop a fingerprint, but of your brain activity. And now suddenly the privacy of your mind, I mean, I'm obviously extrapolating and going insane with this, but the privacy of your mind is suddenly under threat, right? And that's a different, it's similar to this idea of data sovereignty, right? Did you agree at the time to say, hey, my brain data could be open and available, and that it would be taken care of if forces started to manipulate or started to take advantage of that data and cause harm, right, against you, right? So that's another form of that sort of argument in a way. Yeah. So this is just to bring it back to our original topic, or our thinking, acknowledging that qualitative methods and critical theorists have not been treated kindly by the open science movement, and there is a trend towards trying to better situate this push to do things better, especially in a time where there are concerns about public trust in science and how we do things. there should be a real push to come together again, to form community, and to build these bridges across both or across disciplines, and to understand that we're all operating in a similar research community, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully people get a sense for that. Yeah, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is fundamentally or ultimately really important to build community, especially in today's world, right? It's as much as my instinct as a more critical person is to be like, this is all the ways it's not universal. This is all the ways that we have differences. This is all the but at the same time, like, no, I recognize that yes, we there is also a lot of value in finding the similarities and being able to work together despite maybe differences. Like a recent example for me is there's a colleague of mine that I've engaged with his work several times now. I was supposed to guest lecture for him, but it ended up being 1 a.m. my time, so I didn't do it.
Good.
The time zone changed, and I was like, oh wait, never mind. I think we fundamentally disagree on like, he uses the term universal a lot, and I've consistently been like, no. Like, we're never going to agree on this. But there's a dialogue still going, right? And he's just asked me to like look at the draft of his latest book, and I've given him feedback, and so we're still able to have like, I think, a fairly productive conversation, even though we can be like, look, we're not going to agree on this one thing, but we do both care a lot about decolonization. I think it's important. So let's talk about that together, and let's see what we can do productively in that space. And so, we can still find ways to work together towards I guess more positive, what we hope those of us who are working in that space agree is a better science, right? And this is part of why I love SIPs, right? I love being in a space where we're all working towards a better science, and we might not all agree on exactly what that looks like and exactly what we should prioritize first and the details of what that might look to implement, but we're all there to ultimately try to make things better. And I really value that community. Actually, I just told someone else today about SIPs. I tell everybody all the time about SIPs and how they should go. It's the best thing.
Yes. SIPs, for those who aren't familiar, Society for Improving Psychological Science. Mm-hmm. The conference jumps around the world, so it's in
Budapest.
Bulgaria? Oh, Budapest.
Yeah, in Hungary this year.
Budapest this year.
It's in the US then next year.
Well, fingers crossed the US is still standing.
Uh-huh.
But yes. So hopefully it'll come to a place that's accessible to you, and then you can...
Well, there's an online version.
Be a part of a very friendly community.
The online version is happening in May. I mean, submissions have closed now for both versions of the conference, online and in person. But you know what? I've attended the past 2 years without submitting anything, and it's still one of the most valuable conferences I've ever been to.
Yeah. And yet, to highlight, it is a lovely community to be a part of, and that, they exemplify openness, as part of being a part of the open scholarship movement, which is good, I think, which is good. Mm-hmm. Do you have any last thoughts you want to leave us with?
No, I don't know. I think for me, it's what's most important about this is to be having the conversation. And so I encourage actually all our listeners to maybe consider what your worldview and epistemological viewpoint is. What framework do you operate in? And what are the implications of that for the work that you do?
Yeah, and I encourage our listeners to look for bridges to build. Go talk to someone who does qualitative methods. If you're a quantitative researcher, go to and say, hey, like, maybe I can jump on a project and see how your methods work. Maybe we can work together to figure out a problem that we want to solve together, or not solve, but that we want to understand better together. And maybe there's a way to have a qualitative project lead into a quantitative project, or to combine the methods and have converging ideas and evidence and synthesis and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. That's all good, I think. There's all good things to do. Not to toot my own horn, but I did this, right? And now I am working through a qualitative project for the first time. And I've built an open source in browser qualitative analysis thing.
Yes.
It's called Quokka, because I realized I saw like NVivo and Atlas TI are just like extremely expensive subscription license software with pretty clunky interfaces, and I arrogantly went, I have no idea about qualitative analysis, but I'm pretty sure I can build something like that works well. Yeah. So yeah, and so like that's building that bridge has led to a fun project for me where I've created something that I hope is useful for the qualitative analysis community.
Yeah, amazing. It's a good reminder. I'll tell my students next week. We're doing more qual.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell them, here's how you do this in NVivo and how many buttons you have to click.
Oh, we're not doing NVivo.
In Will's app, you just drag and drop stuff. My app is not perfect yet. It's still a work in progress, but still. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the point is good things and good outcomes can come from
absolutely
like stepping across the bridge and trying to work together and learn a bit more about how each other approach. And for those let's say postgraduate students or postdocs, this is I guess more practical advice, but in the job market people are looking for who they can work with, right? And if you show a quality where you are willing to go into other environments and help and contribute and able to kind of talk across multiple methods, that's a pretty good thing to have in any interview or CV or anything. So highly encourage that of our younger audience.
Absolutely. That's great advice.
All right, I guess we can sign off. Sarah, let the people know where they can find you, talk to you, or...
Yeah, no, I've basically left social media. I'm not active on it. So you can find my website. We can link it in. Or actually, the easiest thing is to find my institutional profile. And then my website is linked there. My email is there. So you can contact me that way. Feel free to email me if you want to chat.
Yeah. Look up Sarah Survey at the University of Lincoln.
Yeah, different from Lincoln University. That's in the US. University of Lincoln. That's me.
And if you want to chat to me, the best place is Blue Sky for me, william.bsky.social, or you can check out my website, so williamnyam.github.io. And yeah, hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast. Remember, reproducibility is a grassroots initiative about forming community, especially for early career researchers, around open scholarship and improving science or improving research, no matter what framework you're in. So check us out at reproducibility.org. All right.
Well said.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.